Hey everybody, it's Joe Trippi, and welcome back to That Trippi Show with my co-host Alex Sashlow. If you've been listening recently, you know I keep talking about how much we need to build alternative platforms to communicate the truth. That's why we're so excited to welcome a special guest today, Dave Troy. His Substack, America 2.0, is a must-read. His monthly column, The Wide Angle, is featured in the Washington Spectator, and he also has a podcast, Dave Troy Presents. Dave's one of the people doing the work to break out of the current information ecosystem, deliver the truth, and I think his perspective is really valuable. Dave, welcome.
Glad to be here, Joe. It's good. Thank you for doing this program.
Yeah, well, we've come I don't know, a long way, but a lot's happened since I think we went to a luncheon, Annapolis, months ago. Yeah. And it was great to see you in person, but I'm really, even then, there were a lot of things that you were talking before you launched America 2.0, I think, that registered with me. And so I'm really glad you're here to talk to our audience about some of that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh man, I just realized big faux pas at the top of this. You're not on Substack. America 2.0 is on Ghost. Dave, now that I screwed it up, can you explain why that's important? I know why, and I should have realized it, but can you tell our listeners?
Yeah, not a huge deal in the overall scheme of things, but I think some listeners may be curious. So when I started the America 2.0 website back in late 2024, I looked at the available options, and of course have been watching Substack and others kind of gain traction over the course of the last few years. And I made the decision to publish America 2.0 on the Ghost platform, which some people probably haven't heard of. But it's basically an open source kind of equivalent to what Substack does, but it's something that I can own myself. I don't have to give Substack a cut. And the reason why that maybe is of concern is, and we'll talk more about this, is platform capture and what that means for the future of democracy. Because as Substack has grown, they've attracted a really quite large number of authors who are, quite dependent on the platform also. And, the firm took in something on the order of, at least $20 million, I believe, in just 2021 or so to try to expand the platform. And the money came from Andreessen Horowitz, who is one of the kind of firms that's unfortunately, more often than not finding itself aligned with kind of anti-democratic values. So, Mark Andreessen, for example, has been helping Elon Musk recruit people for the DOGE initiative. So I just made the decision that I don't want to become dependent and, at any point on these tech platforms that are connected to these kinds of illiberal movements. And so one of the things I would hope to do over time is to, get more people to move onto the Ghost platform, which does actually function also as a network, and has some similar properties to Substack, but is something that people can own themselves. So again, just an important distinction when talking about platforms and technology.
Yeah, no, Dan Gilmore, who posts on Says Us, is also a proponent of Ghost and tries to explain to people why Substack may not be the best place to be. So,
and I've been talking to Dan as well about that. How do we get more people onto Ghost? So long-term agenda there.
Alex, where do you want to get started?
So, Dave, you've actually been researching disinformation since before most people kind of had a clue about what disinformation really was. And I'm pretty sure you're our first guest to have something exhibited in MoMA, which is pretty cool. But
probably
just to start us off, give some kind of context to the listeners. How'd you get to where you are now?
Yeah, so long story, but basically my background is as a technology entrepreneur. So I've been, kind of in the tech game since the 1980s. And I started an internet service provider in about 1994. So that kind of gave me a front row seat to a lot of the early development of the internet. And I sold that company in 2004. And shortly after that, I started doing a lot of research into social media and sort of how people were using it and looking at some of the data that was available on platforms like Twitter, LinkedIn, and Facebook. And so I actually was one of the first developers to use the Twitter API, and started looking at like how networks form on Twitter, what the topology of them is, how information is shared and spread over networks like Twitter, because ultimately that kind of stuff really hadn't been available until then. So I got to know the founding team at Twitter fairly well. And by the time that people were talking about, disinformation and whatnot in like 2015, 2016, 2017, I had been studying the space, somewhat informally, but, definitely studying it for, nearly a decade at that point. So I had a lot of things to say about it, and did so at that time. As you mentioned, I had some stuff in the MoMA. I did a TED Talk in like 2014 about network analysis, looking at how communities form in cities on Twitter. So when Cambridge Analytica happened, I knew what was going on with that and was in a position to speak about it. And so I've been looking at kind of hybrid warfare, information warfare, and really how it interfaces with history over the past 8 years or so. And the America 2.0 project, which you mentioned at the outset, is really an effort to kind of capture all the things that we've been learning. And I work with a small team of peers and researchers who share notes on various topics. And so all of the things that we've kind of mined as being like interesting storylines or things that can be illuminating are things that we're trying to put out over America 2.0. So it's kind of that culmination of a lot of years of effort.
Yeah, it's a must read. We're going to put it in our show notes so that people really should be reading America 2.0. Your latest, or most recent column, I think, on Elon in American Spectator, Elon Musk and the American Endgame, you had a pretty strong message there, and I'd like for you to sort of go through that again. The takeover of X, and where this is all going, or what the motive and what's happening, and what the strong message you want to deliver is.
Yeah, so a lot of people obviously have been watching this situation with Musk kind of unfold with DOGE, over the last few weeks, and this is something that I've been writing about and warning about for a couple of years at least. I guess I first made a sort of public announcement about Musk in 2021, so really over 3 years ago now. And, at first people were like, what are you talking about? Musk, he's involved with Trump and Peter Thiel, and they're going to take over America. I'm like, yeah, actually, that's what's going to happen. So in this most recent piece, what I was really kind of trying to stress to people is that we don't really have any kind of institutional mechanism for dealing with this nature of an attack. So what is, Musk doing? He's basically going in kind of on nights and weekends with this team of tech guys who, are ranging in age between like 19 and 25, with some other managers thrown in the mix, to really, go into the very heart of database systems, websites, sort of all of these different processes that actually power government. And they're making what I would consider to be like de facto changes, policy changes, by changing how things work. So, they're pushing code into systems, they're downloading databases and doing God knows what with them. It's basically operating faster than Washington can respond to it. And if you know about, there's a concept called fourth generation warfare. And there's a guy named Colonel John Boyd, who came up with this concept of what he calls the OODA loop. That's OODA, and that stands for observe, orient, decide, and act. And he describes this process as what fighter pilots do when they're actually flying a plane, because you're flying along, you basically need to be constantly observing what's happening, and then you orient yourself to the information you get from your observations, and then you make a decision, and then you act, and that loop runs constantly. And for a fighter pilot, it runs pretty fast. But in Washington, D.C., that OODA loop runs very, very slowly. It's much more like a low metabolism kind of creature, And so the way stuff happens in Washington, as you well know, is that, somebody notices something, somebody else writes a few emails or maybe a memo. Somebody else says, yeah, we should look into that. They commission a study. The study gets done. That takes 3 months or longer. Some people read the study. Then after a while, they have some meetings about the study to decide what to do. And then maybe, 6 months later, something happens. That's just way too slow for what these guys are doing. They're coming in on nights and weekends and dismantling databases. So, the idea that you're going to use the Washington-style OODA loop to attack that, or to deal with that kind of an attack is, not really workable. So that's kind of what's going on. And that's what I wanted to kind of, warn Congress about, is that they're proceeding with this attack. It's rooted in a variety of philosophical, different, sort of points of view and worldviews that are driving it. In particular, there's Neoreactionary thought, which is enabling them to attract these sort of, younger men who are thinking, this sort of guy who goes by like big balls and whatnot. They've got these kids who are sort of been radicalized into these online communities that have been seeded by these right-wing, philosophy, sort of pseudo-philosophy purveyors. And so it makes a really toxic mix, and we just don't have any decent way of stopping this right now. So it's a very dangerous situation.
Trust me, I get you. I totally get you on how long it takes for anything to happen in Washington. But if Congress can't do much to stop this, the courts are about it, or even slower sometimes than Congress, although they can, do injunctions and things. Is there anything that can be done?
Well, I think Congress, the biggest sort of pathway towards sanity that I can see is, perhaps some portion of the Republican Party is going to wake up to the true nature of this attack. And if you had maybe a third of Republicans that were like, hey, wait a minute, this is actually insane and not what we voted for, and it's over the top, and they could partner with Democrats, I think you would, have at least some capacity to have Congress take some action that would halt some of this by way of changing the laws or, doing things that would have some kind of tangible effect on it. But they would have to decide on what those things were, and I'm not even sure that they have that capacity right now. But the first thing there is to try to create some kind of schism within the Republican Party. I think, the second thing is, the courts have some capability here, and, we've seen some temporary decisions from courts to try to slow certain things down. But again, even with like a court order, that has to translate into some kind of enforcement action. And of course, under our, 3-branch system of government, enforcement comes under the executive branch. And many people in the executive branch are aligned to, inclined to follow, the wishes of the president, whether rightly or wrongly. So I think, again, this kind of de facto policymaking by showing up on site, on buildings, at buildings, and spending, nights and weekends, they have a tremendous kind of practical advantage over anybody that might try to stop them. But again, we'll see how it plays out. But right now, I think those are kind of the dynamics that are in play.
Yeah, I don't think a lot of our readers are familiar with the name Curtis Yarvin, but his theories are a driving force behind a lot of what Elon and those guys are doing. Can you talk a little bit about that and what the motivation is, what's going on here?
Sure, yeah. So, I think there's multiple motivations. Obviously, there's some alignment with, the desires of Russia and China, and they have kind of their own views on this. When it comes to Curtis Yarvin and the neo-reactionary movement, this is basically a software engineer and blogger who has sort of absorbed a lot of neo-reactionary thought from the 20th century and kind of packaged it into his own sort of tech-friendly version, and has become very influential within the Silicon Valley milieu. So people like Peter Thiel and Elon Musk kind of have been very influenced by Yarvin. Yarvin is also written under the name Mencius Moldbug, and he writes these kinds of long, thought experimenty kind of essays about how the United States really needs a monarch and that democracy doesn't work. and that, real leadership is about exerting your will over everybody else, and that's the only way that things are going to be efficient. There's a lot of write-ups, especially right now, about Yarvin that are available. And at America 2.0, we just published 10 days or so ago a memo that was put together by an anonymous group of authors who have some familiarity with the neo-reactionary movement. And it's about 20 some pages long, and it outlines really the full motivation and underlying ideology of this neo-reactionary movement. And I recommend folks go check it out. It's linked to in an article on our site called America Under Attack Week 2, What We're Monitoring. And you'll see it there. But basically, it's, very much a warning that says that, they intend to dismantle the American federal government as much as they possibly can, and to basically install a kind of a monarch that replaces that kind of decision-making with, some sort of, small elite, led by a single CEO. And just to read from this memo here, it says, rather than operating as an ally of the Trump administration, Musk has hijacked its ambitions for his own purposes. His rapid takeover of federal infrastructure mirrors the broader ambitions of the neo-reactionary movement, a small group of Silicon Valley elites who reject democracy and seek to install a CEO monarch to rule by technological and financial dominance. This network includes Peter Thiel, Mark Andreessen, Balaji Srinivasan, David Sachs, and Curtis Yarvin, among others. Once considered fringe, purveyors of this ideology have now been embedded into the core of government operations. So it kind of goes on in that vein, and many of you may recognize certain of those names and not others. But for those of you who have been following Silicon Valley's influence over Washington, I think all of those names will probably be familiar. So it's a very active situation, and people are not broadly familiar with it. I happen to have written about Yarvin in a piece about 8 years ago. So those of us who have kind of been following it closely have been aware of this. But again, you never know kind of like which influences are going to become the most dominant ones at any given time. And this one has come out with a vengeance in the last couple of weeks.
Yeah, this goes back further than people realize. I think you had previously written about Project Russia, a series of books distributed in late 2000s to high-ranking Russian officials. And
right.
This quote from you, quote, "The books assert that democracies do not work and cannot be salvaged. They argue that democracies are necessarily decadent and that Russia is morally superior. This moral superiority is interpreted to mean that all democracies are a natural enemy and must be fought. That fight will necessarily lead to a controlled global collapse, after which a new supranational state may be established under the leadership of an enlightened elite." That's looks like what Elon's trying to step into there for sure.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the thing, is that these things are all sort of broadly compatible. And it sounds crazy because it is kind of crazy. And I think it was difficult for people to kind of get their heads wrapped around the idea that these kinds of like very ambitious plans might be in the works. And everybody was kind of concerned about Project 2025, and like rightly so. I mean, there's a lot of stuff in there that's very damaging and is in fact happening. But I would consider, like sort of the Project 2025 to be sort of the smallest subset, the neo-reactionary to be a little bit bigger set than that, and then this Project Russia bigger than the neo-reactionary stuff still. And it all points in the same direction, so.
So expand upon Project Russia for, I doubt a ton of our listeners understand that one yet, which is a little scary given what the scope is that you're talking about here.
Yeah, it's a pretty not, like in the West, nobody really knows anything about Project Russia. And I was kind of surprised. I came across this, back in October or so. And, I'm pretty familiar with a lot of Russian writing about Western collapse and what grievances against the West, but I had missed this. And, it's not been covered by a lot of analysts at all. And part of it is because this is, as Joe mentioned, it's a series of books that was released between 2005 and 2010 in Russia, authored anonymously, and it was sent to basically all the sort of high-level people in the country. So everybody from, government officials to people in the Kremlin to cultural influencers and celebrities and, whoever else. And basically what it argues is that, what Joe just said, that democracies don't work and that Russia is superior to democracies because they sort of recognize that democracies don't work. They also happen to, have God on their side because they have the Russian Orthodox Church, and that's the best church. And so pretty much what they argue is for a system, a plan to undermine democracies globally, but particularly the United States, because for them, the United States is kind of the great global demon. In some cases, they refer to it as like the Antichrist. And basically, it's the dollar that they're most upset about, because from their perspective, the fiat currency, sort of the US dollar, and the Federal Reserve being able to print as many dollars as they see fit, they believe that makes America prone to military adventurism, to imperialism, and to global conquest that otherwise, they're basically annoying the Russians and the Chinese from their perspective. So it would be really nice if the dollar didn't exist, because then the U.S. couldn't pursue all of its sort of, aggressive foreign policy stances that Russia doesn't like. Now, what you can get into a long argument about whether the Russians have an argument there or not. Maybe in some, limited sense, they have at least some kind of an argument. But to some extent, a lot of their complaints are basically just kind of grievance porn and fantasy that they, sit up at night thinking about how if it wasn't for the United States, everything would be great in Russia. And I think, that's also a pretty specious argument. So at any rate, they basically outline a plan for long-term undermining of the West, and particularly the United States. And the way that, they foresee kind of doing that is through subversion and capture of whatever they can. But ultimately, they want to blow up the dollar and the Federal Reserve. And so, if you look at the things that are coming under target, by the Kremlin right now, and which they're cheerleading the most, it is things like, the taking down of USAID, the capture of the FBI, the capture of the Director of National Intelligence in the form of, Tulsi Gabbard. So up next is going to be the CIA. And we're already seeing some chatter that points in that direction. And of course, the Federal Reserve is going to be up next. So, you can see a direct mapping from kind of the Project Russia list of grievances to what's actually playing out in the form of DOGE and the Kremlin's cheerleading of DOGE's actions.
And then you also have like the technocratic movement. I guess Elon grandfather's part of that. Even getting arrested on charges of overthrowing the Canadian government. How does that come into play?
Yeah, so what you're referring to is a movement that was started in the late 1920s, early 1930s called Technocracy. And it was built around the ideas of a couple of thinkers, including Thorstein Veblen, who is a famous economist who coined the phrase conspicuous consumption. So he got together with a guy named Howard Scott, who was sort of a younger protege of Veblen. And Howard Scott took these ideas kind of to the next level and came up with a whole kind of philosophy and system of thought for measuring everything that happens in the economy in a very technical way. He came up with this idea for currency based on energy units, which actually kind of is a forerunner of the idea of like Bitcoin. He has this whole idea for like technical management of society in the world. And so you have to think about what was happening in the country right at that moment too. You're right in the wake of the Great Depression. And so the kind of assumption that people were having at that point was, well, maybe sort of straight up capitalism actually doesn't work. And that the price-based system of markets and controls and stuff just doesn't function. It leads to these kinds of destructive outcomes. So what we really need is smart scientific engineering types to just basically plan the entire economy and, give everybody a certain amount of energy units that they can spend on different things. And we'll have beautiful, utopian harmony because all the assets will be properly managed by smart people. So as you mentioned, Elon Musk's grandfather, who was a chiropractor by the name of Joshua Haldeman, who lived in Western Canada, he became very involved with the technocracy movement. It was outlawed in Canada in the early 1940s. And I think Haldeman was charged and possibly, I guess he was arrested in like 1941, I want to say. And the charge was that, the technocracy movement was challenging the legitimacy of the Canadian government. It was aligned with the Nazis. And you can I read a book about this a couple of days ago, so I have a lot of facts at hand. But the Germans adopted a similar set of ideas, and they were aware of sort of the Howard Scott technocracy strain of thought, but they kind of modified it for their own purposes and did it kind of their own way. So you could make an argument that the Nazis were really the first attempt to implement a kind of technocratic solution, in their government. And as you can see, aspects of that certainly were, exhibited in the Holocaust and things like that too. So a fairly dark way of thinking about how to run a society. But for whatever reasons, it seems as though that strain of thought has had at least some impact on people like Elon Musk, who I have a hard time thinking that he doesn't know about his grandfather's involvement in technocracy. And there's various other, schools of thought that have kind of been influenced by technocracy over the years. So I would say that that's, if you were thinking of this being like a musical recording or something, technocracy is deep in the mix. It's maybe not the melody track, but it's deep in the mix.
If you look at how the whole technocracy thing was supposed to play out, it was essentially a united North America with parts of South America put together. And how does that jive with the idea that with Elon and Trump being Russian puppets and Project Russia trying to kind of destabilize the dollar and break up the United States, like, doesn't one of those seem like a kind of strong way to kind of rule basically a continent, and then the other is kind of the decline of the American empire, so to speak? How do those fit together?
Well, I think, we're still sort of waiting to see exactly what some of these things might actually mean. They've been making all these sorts of moves against Canada and Mexico, and what is the end goal there? Hard to say. As you point out, one of the maps that was generated by Technocracy Inc., which was the actual sort of structural entity that ran Howard Scott's technocracy movement, was to combine Canada, the United States, and Mexico, and a little bit of northern South America, like Venezuela and Colombia, into a kind of North American technate, they called it. And the reason why they sort of focused in on that was that Scott considered that kind of to be the minimum viable unit for technocracy to function properly. It was just sort of how much room did you need to kind of have the system work? And he identified that unit. Now, the real question is, what exactly are we seeing right now? And I think that that's one lens through which you can look at it. The other thing is that there wasn't necessarily, or at least I have not seen evidence of specificity when it comes to the nature of the technocratic model of governance, when it comes to things like, sort of federal rule. So while on the one hand, that technate would include all of that area and landmass, in general, the mode of governance is basically to not have strong central governments, but instead to have lots of decentralized weak governments. What you could maybe imagine, if you just sort of think about it for a second, is this broad technate, which, oh, by the way, includes Greenland, so that's another hint.
Right.
Would include these sort of, like, let's say you have the United States, so the Californian government and the New York government and the Maryland government and stuff might be united in the technate, but they wouldn't be governed by a strong federal government. They would just be these sort of small local states that would all federate together into a single model. And so it wouldn't be, sort of this like hyper focused, like strong thing. And I think the thing you have to think about with respect to Russia is that they don't want, a stronger United States to emerge out of this. And in fact, all of their designs have been very explicit that what they want to do is basically devolve the power of the federal government to local governments, state governments, and they also want to break up the United States. So there's an effort to, have Texas secede from the Union. There's an effort to have California secede from the Union and so forth. And so, these sort of things are in tension right now. And I think we don't know exactly the direction that this is going for sure. All we know is that these are influences that are in the mix. And I think that by unlocking kind of the tiles of the puzzle right now, by creating chaos, we're setting up a pathway for some future new state to emerge. We just don't know exactly what it's going to be yet. But, needless to say, by unlocking the puzzle tiles, we are creating an opportunity for, a lot of chaos to play out.
So maybe you just answered the question I was about to ask you, because you've pointed out that the Fed is, likely their next target. Ron Paul's been long an advocate for killing the Federal Reserve. I was going to say, why is this such a big target for them? But it's your last bit there sort of may answer that question. But is this about destroying the dollar? Is it about, creating the Bitcoin reserve? Or just the latitude to do whatever they want?
Well, I think ultimately all of this is really about power and gaining as much power as possible. So, I think look at that lens first. In terms of like ideology and what they may actually be trying to achieve practically, destroying the Federal Reserve and replacing it with something else has long been sort of part of the, let's say, the right-wing, libertarian, and Russia-aligned imagination, because they all kind of go together. And so if you look at Ron Paul, who you mentioned, who is now 89 years old, and of course his son Rand Paul is the senator from Kentucky, they've been very clear that they want to end the Federal Reserve. And of course, people will say things like they just want to audit it or whatever. But no, Ron Paul wrote a book called End the Fed. And when you go to gatherings where Ron Paul is speaking, everybody is chanting End the Fed. So it's pretty clear they want to end the Fed. And in the 1970s and maybe into the 1980s, Ron Paul worked with a Christian strategist by the name of Gary North on what they call the North Paul strategy. And basically, it's this strategy that we heard outlined when you mentioned Project Russia. It's to crash the dollar purposely with the intent of introducing what they would call biblical money. And what they mean by that is like hard money rooted in the gold standard. And they fundamentally believe that fiat currency and interest and all these kinds of things are evil things that have been introduced by the devil. And what we really need is gold money that can be hoarded. And, of course, that has all kinds of negative economic consequences. Like if you really had, a strictly gold standard type, money system, besides for just it being kind of impractical and you having to come up with some kind of a mechanism to deal with the impracticality of it, it would all be rooted in gold, right? So gold is fundamentally deflationary. And so you basically would end up with, economic contraction because people wouldn't want to spend their money. And, you want a little bit of inflation in an economy in order to grow it. So, that's why the Fed has a mandate to try to keep inflation at like 2%.
But overlapping or underlying all this too is sort of the Christian nationalist white thing movement. In terms of Russia, I think in terms of how so many people have, view Russia as an ally to get this done within the Christian community too. On top of all these other things that you've talked about, there's even more other networks that are entangled in all of this, I think.
Well, definitely. And one of the things that Gary North, and sort of some of these other Christian, nationalist types started doing was networking with their peers in Russia. And so you have to think about Russia in terms of being kind of like a factional, situation. The same way we are here. We have different factions of power that are in play. So, during the Soviet years, there was obviously, the people that were kind of devoted to, the Communist Party and the functioning of the Soviet state and all of that. But then there were also all of these white Russian networks that had, sort of been left as remnants after the Bolshevik Revolution. And, officially in Russia, religion was outlawed under Stalin and whatnot. Didn't have people officially worshiping in the way that they had before. And so, all of the kind of church networks became kind of networks in exile. So starting in like the 1950s, Billy Graham and a few others started like traveling to Russia to sort of connect with the church-going people of Russia. And that sort of ended up being a toehold into what we see today, which is the full cross-pollination between the Christian right in the United States and the Christian right in Russia. So starting in like 1995, there was a group called the World Congress of Families that started networking heavily with counterparts in Russia connected to the Russian Orthodox Church. And so you had people like Timothy Malafeyev and Vladimir Yakunin, who became networked very tightly with their sort of American counterparts, which in turn led to connections into the National Prayer Breakfast and the group called The Family, which is connected to that, as well as into the NRA. So this kind of like alignment between the Christian right became sort of fully overlapping with this set of goals around killing the Federal Reserve through, Gary North, Ron Paul, Alan Carlson, Malafeyev, Yakunin, and we now see that network, configuration now bearing fruit in the form of actually producing visible results that may have, sort of world-changing consequences.
So, look, I don't want to turn this into a Says Us commercial, but got together. I was asking for advice about, when you launch a new network, what do we need? What are some of and still wrestling with how do you make sure, even as you bring investors in, that you're not going to get bought by an Elon someday and all that, all those things. But to not turn it into that, what I wanted to ask you is, you look at what's happening on X and how it's playing into all this. What's the pro-democracy counter to all this? What's the most important thing we should all be doing right now? Is there anything we can do? And how do you, I know you America 2.0, but we've got to have some kind of information distribution network for democracy, I think, to counter all this stuff, or am I dreaming? I just want to get your take.
Yeah, sure. So I think you're absolutely right. I mean, there needs to be more infrastructure for kind of spreading pro-democracy type messaging, and also, connecting people in networks of trust. I see this as kind of a two-pronged problem. One is, for a long time, people like you and me, the last decade or so, have been kind of stuck in this mode of, and not, stuck, but this is just the sort of set of cards we got dealt of defending democracy. Sure, democracy is very much worth defending, and we should totally do that. On the other hand, it also put us in the unenviable position of trying to defend like all aspects of the status quo. And, there's things about the status quo that need work. I think we all agree
absolutely.
to that,
Yeah.
So it's kind of like, do you really want to be stuck defending the status quo? And I think that what we found throughout this process was that, defending the status quo was kind of a losing proposition. And it just didn't work. At the end of the day, the numbers overwhelmed what we were able to do. And, for whatever reasons, there's long postmortem we could get into. But, it hasn't really worked that well. So I think that the position that we're kind of in now from a messaging and strategic standpoint is, how do we articulate a future vision for democracy that is worth fighting for? How do we make democracy like dangerous and edgy again? I keep thinking about how cool, the founding fathers must have been and felt back in 1776. Here's these guys, they're getting together, they're reading John Locke and Rousseau and, Voltaire, and they're coming up with these crazy ideas for government. And they're basically technologists of their time, coming up with these ideas that are experimental. People are attracted to the ideas, they're attracted to them. And they did something incredibly edgy that kind of fueled, many other democracies and many other revolutions for, centuries to come. I mean, well into the 19th century, you had countries modeling their governments on the United States. So, that was an incredibly appealing act. And what our response to that has kind of been since then is to kind of be like, oh, no, those guys had it all right. We should just keep doing that. When in fact, I think we need to kind of sharpen our knives a little bit and come up with some, ideas that are maybe a little bit more exciting than that meet the moment, that deal with the fact that we are living in a changing technological world. And I think it's a meetable challenge, but we have to kind of get into that headspace. And I think we've been so busy trying to build walls and, keep the floodwaters at bay that we just haven't really taken on that task fully. So that's one part. The other part is we need better technology and tools to kind of, organize, to spread messaging around. We need to figure out how to be inclusive. One of the things that I find very annoying about, a lot of what's going on in the tech world is people are coming up with all these sort of models that are effectively like country clubs, like you have in the crypto space, a thing called the distributed autonomous organization, which, allows you to kind of build up models of governance and have people participate. And, but it's sort of like having a little company or a nonprofit or something. But it's the governance model is very much like, a country club. You sort of join, you can participate, but it's very exclusive because most people aren't in the country club. And when it comes to thinking about how do you empower the average citizen or retirees or, grandma, how do you get everybody in? And that's the beauty of democracy, because it serves, the demos, the everybody. And I think that a lot of these kind of tech-driven ideas really fall short on that perspective. And I think, until you figure out ways to include really absolutely everybody, or at least intend to include everybody, you're doing something, but it isn't democracy. So I think, those are kind of the fronts that we need to be thinking about. And, with respect to social networks and stuff, I mean, it's difficult because, all these things need money if they're centralized. You need moderation if it's centralized. That requires a business model that pays for itself. So, things like Blue Sky, I'm a little bit cautious about because right now they've kind of set themselves up to be a giant sort of money hole, but without any way to generate enough revenue to kind of offset those expenses. So it points to something that will get captured at some point, and then the question is by whom and for what purpose. So I think everybody just should use caution when thinking about these business models, because they can get kind of too big for their own britches, and it's difficult. So I think something like what you've been pursuing with Says Us, you and Evgeny and whatnot, is very cool, and I think you guys have kind of the right value system to kind of ensure that you're not going to get captured, but that's going to require constant vigilance too.
Yeah, no, tell me about it. I mean, we've raised about $1 million and got it. We're now in the Apple and Google app stores, and it's starting to take off. But the capture question is going to be something. It's even hard to answer. I think it was one of the things you asked me at lunch, and I was like, I think I mumbled. I have still trying to figure that one out. But look, I think, and I'll end on this, but I was talking to somebody of getting back to having a bigger vision about where to go from here. Imagine today that we were trying to, write the rules for democracy that would take into account all the technological changes that will happen between now and 250 years from now. That's what those founders actually did. And, damn, it's had a pretty good run. But that's part of what we need to do now is see this as an opportunity, I think. I mean, if we can hold on to it, which is questionable, all the things you've brought up. But, we still got the 2026 elections where we may be able to take the House, slow it down a little, and maybe get it back and keep fighting. But it is that vision that I think, how does democracy work today and into the future, projecting, I mean, the rules they set or the values they set. But I think that's one of the critical things we need to all work on as we make this fight. Dave, I want to thank you for coming on, and thank everyone for listening to That Trippi Show. Check out America 2.0 at america2.news. We'll link to it in the show notes. And you check out, we are in the App Store, says us, SEZ.US. Join us there, check us out. We're trying to build a community of trust, and that's what I think is also really important, is that we, one, let everybody in. You have freedom of speech, but you don't have a guaranteed freedom to amplified reach, which I think does happen on the other platforms, even Blue Sky. But I think there are a lot of platforms where the motives are there. I hope you'll check out one of them at SEZ.US. This podcast will always be free and is part of Resolute Square, so check out the latest at resolutesquare.com/Trippi. And please subscribe to That Trippi Show. Leave a review on Apple or wherever you listen. And if you're listening to this episode on YouTube, please like and subscribe to get alerts when we post the next one. You can always send us a question to thattrippishow@gmail.com. We did a lousy job of getting to any of those today, but leave us a question to review on iTunes, and we'll see you next week. Dave, thanks so much for being on. Very, very provocative and a lot to think about. And I hope our listeners learned a lot, and we'll visit you at America 2.0.
Resolute Square.